So welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar is entitled I Didn't Fit In and I Couldn't See a Way Out. It's a particularly interesting topic around young men's suicide and recognition that suicide takes more young men in rural places than it does in urban places. And so with the great work from Genevieve, who's a postdoctoral fellow with us on the Man-Up Against Suicide and funded by Michael Smith. We ventured into Rimbey, and we also had terrific help from Christina, who's a doctoral student on the Man-Up Against Suicide project, funded by Movember. And so what we did was we went into Rimbey and interviewed some participants and really collected some very powerful stories around men's depression and suicide. And really to chronicle that story, I've got both Christina and Genevieve here today to share the experience of having been up in Rimbey. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so I'm Christina, and I'm the project manager working on an Up Against Suicide project. And today's webinar with Jen, we'll talk about the recent Up project and the photo exhibition that we had in Rimbey, Alberta. And before going into too much details, we thought it might be useful to have to give you a little 101 about the Men Up Against Suicide project and exactly like what we're doing. So I'll briefly talk about our project and what we are trying to achieve and what we have done so far. So first, just to give you a little background, the Men Up Against Suicide project is one of the 5 sub-projects of the Men's Depression and Suicide Network, which was funded by Movember Canada's Men's Mental Health Initiative. And in this project, basically what we are trying to accomplish is to better understand experiences of individuals who are affected by men's suicide. So that includes men who previously had suicidal thoughts, as well as men and women who have lost a male to suicide. So this is to find a targeted suicide prevention and intervention programs, which are sensitive to men specifically, but also to raise awareness of men's suicide and mental health in general by sharing these individuals' experiences and perspectives. So in the Men Up Against Suicide research, we use a very interesting research method called photo voice. And photo voice research derives from a very simple but powerful concept of giving the lens to participants. That is to let them talk about their realities and their own concerns and perspectives and share them with the public. For instance, in our project, participants were asked to take photos that represent their realities and perspectives of men's suicide, be it their own suicidal experiences or experiences of losing someone to suicide. And then the participants were invited to an interview with us to talk about their experiences through the photos that they have taken for the project. So as you can see, yeah, so that's the slide. So as you can see, the photo, the pictures in the photo voice research can be so powerful. And because, you know, they were taken by the very people who were affected by the topic of the study, in our case, the men's suicide. And they can be also so powerful because the photos can provide not only factual and contextual information, but also they share individuals' deeper personal meanings and sense-making, and the very element, in my opinion, that gets to people's emotional side and creating connections. So one visitors to our photo exhibition commented how powerful these photos can be. A quote, these photos and their narratives gave the topic of suicide a personality and emotion, rather than an outline of consequences, which would have sunk into the usual helpline advertisements, unquote. And also another great feature of a photo voice research is by participating in such project, participants, they gain opportunities to think over their own realities and grasping new insights and understandings about the particular issue, and witness how their voices can reach the broader audiences through photo exhibits. Okay, so in the Men Up Against Suicide project, so far, we have interviewed 58 participants and received a good few of hundreds of photographs. And of these photos, we have used 72 images and their narratives for the 4 photo exhibitions that we have hosted since May 2014. And one of the 4 photo exhibitions was in Rimbey, Alberta, on the 16th of this month. So you can go online at www.menupagainstsuicide.ca to view these photos and also to see the past and the upcoming photo exhibitions. Okay, so that's it for that little intro. And now Jen will talk more about the Men Up Against Suicide project in Rimbey, Alberta.
Okay, thanks, Christina. So the idea for the Rimbey project came from a participant, Anna Palm, there she is on the screen, who became a member of our team after she told us the story of her brother Eli, who died by suicide. Now, Emma's an artist, and she saw great value in the process of taking photos and sharing with them as a means to process her own experience. And actually, as a part of her grad project for art school, she took photos of friends of her brothers in places that were special to them, and they were able to talk about their response to his death. So she actually did her own photo elicitation project prior to participating in ours. She felt it was important for the Men Up Against Suicide conversation about men's suicide to go outside of the city and to go into rural contexts where men's depression have greater prevalence and less voice. So the epidemiology of suicide can be problematic. Rural men have about 4 to 8 times the suicide rate as their urban counterparts. Now this chart is somewhat dated, but the rates are similar. So findings from this report were obtained from CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and it talks about how the Metropolitan Influence Zone, or the MIZ classification, developed by Statistics Canada, was used to distinguish between urban and different types of rural communities. So the MIZ definition is based on population density and distance, but it also considers the commuting flow between rural and small towns and larger centers. So urban areas are defined as census metropolitan areas, or CMAs, and census agglomerations, CAs. So the MIZ zones are assigned on the basis of the share of the workforce that commutes to any CMA or CA. So the take-home message being that the more rural, the less influence of the metropolitan, the higher the suicide rates for men. So prior to going to Rimbey, we did a bit of a literature review, and the findings tend to talk about a link between rural suicide and lifestyle challenges, which include managing crops, and in the context of really uncertain weather conditions and often financial insecurities. The idea of the rural ideal has been associated with rugged individualism, in which toiling through hardship with one's head held high is both expected and revered by the wider community. And furthermore, men's employment in resource extraction and farming is strongly associated with performances of strength and resilience. And alongside that, access to confidential and professional help for depression can be really challenging, all of which increases the risk of men's suicide. So the aim of this study was to bring the Man Up Against Suicide project to the small community of Rimbey, Alberta, to garner rural men's and women's experiences of men's suicide, as well as to provide a forum for the conversations around men's suicide prevention program. So specifically the research questions were, what were the perceptions and attitudes towards men's suicide among residents of a small rural community? Which place-based factors contribute to men's suicide, and what place-based factors can be strengthened to prevent men's suicide? So These are some of the statistics about Rimbey that I gleaned from the StatsCan 2006 community profile. So a population of around 2,400, a very Caucasian dominated population, largely English. There's a few Aboriginal people, even though Rimbey is located right next to a reserve. Still not that many Aboriginal people within the community. Men tend to be employed in the gas and oil industries, as well as agriculture and trade. And women tend to be employed in the healthcare, social assistance, education, and trade as well. So as you can see, our recruitment largely recruited women. We recruited through snowball methods, posters, and an ad in the Rimbey Review. And I think it's important to note that only one of the participants that we got was as a result of third-party advertising. So the rest were word of mouth by people who knew Emma and her family or her friends. And this is consistent with findings in the literature, as well as my own experience doing health research in rural contexts. Unlike with more urban participants who respond to study advertisements, rural participants seem to be more conscious and sensitive and maybe more suspicious of outsiders. And it really speaks to the necessity of having someone on the ground. And the research must have a significant element of community engagement. Why is this research important? What is the emotional connection? And there were other differences I just wanted to highlight between urban and Rimbey participants. So once people committed to the study, they really wanted to help. So when I went to the community, there were multiple offers of accommodation, of meeting places and dinner invites, so a very warm welcome. People wanted to know how they could help on every level of the study, with the exhibit and with the research, and what other assistance could they offer. And interestingly, with a couple of exceptions, people saw the offer of an honorarium as actually surprising and unnecessary. So they said they would donate the money to a crisis support or mental health organization, but they really didn't want it to be seen as they were being paid to do something that they saw as benefiting and helping the community. So I wanted to begin this discussion of the findings with the story of Eli. So this is Emma's brother. So he was a 17-year-old boy whose suicide story initiated this project in Rimbey. And in this project, I got to speak with both of his older sisters, his mother and his father. So that compiled the story that I'm about to tell. So, of course, all suicides are tragic, and this particular suicide rocked the community of Rimbey because it seemed so unexpected and out of the blue. So Eli was, by all accounts, a very happy, popular, athletic teen who was very strongly connected to his family. Eli grew up in Rimbey, surrounded by an extended family and a cohort of cousins that were all his own age. So a bunch of little boys running around together was the story of many people who knew the family. He was very close to his parents and his older sisters. They had an exceptionally warm, loving, and supportive relationship. And Eli seemed very engaged in his community. He was captain of the soccer and the basketball team. He did track and field. He played the piano. He got good grades. He was friends with a wide variety of people. And on June 26th, it was the last day of grade 11. Eli and his mom were at home before his soccer practice. And he got a phone call from the school principal saying that it had been reported that he and some other boys had been texting during an exam. He told his mother, and she was really upset with him. So she's a teacher herself, and she was angry that he had made such a poor decision. And she told him that he should not go to soccer practice, and he agreed. And she left to go back to work, and Eli stayed home. So by the time his mom got to the school, she was feeling badly for their argument, and she texted Eli to connect. And then she texted again after not hearing back. And she said, it was then I knew that something had gone wrong. He always texted back. So she called his dad, who was working in Edmonton, to see if he had heard from her. And when he said that he hadn't, she got into her car to drive home. So at this point, her anxiety is mounting. And she ran into the house calling his name. And she said, you know, the house was so quiet, eerily so. She went from room to room calling his name, but to no avail. And when she came back downstairs, she noticed a note on the table, and she scanned to the end and read Eli's final words. And screaming, she sprinted to the shed and found her son, gray and cold, hanging from the rafters. So Eli's parents and older sister read his letter later that evening. And in the letter he said, "Mom, I'm so sorry for this. Please don't blame yourself, but I've decided to take my own life. This has nothing to do with anyone. It's completely my own choice. I've had no joy in life for a long time now, and I feel terrible for being a disappointment to you and Dad. I don't like who I am." And Eli goes on to write about how deeply he loves his parents and how grateful he is for the life he gave them and how much he looks up to them both. And he also writes about his depression and his thought that it would never go away, so he just couldn't go on. He asked them to try to think about his suicide as his pain ending. He says, "No parent should ever have to experience the death of their own child, especially when you guys have given me such an amazing life. I'm going to hang myself in the shop." So Eli's letter left no room for doubt that this had been a spur-of-the-moment action. His father reflected on how much planning must have gone into finding the right type of rope to hold his 6-foot stature and to tie the right knot. And of course, his family agonized over his death. What had they missed? What were the signs of this terrible pain that he must have been experiencing to take his young life? Why would he not feel like he could have said something? So almost 800 people came for his funeral, and his sister talked about how in the front row sat his soccer team, all wearing their soccer jerseys as a sign of honor and respect. And I tell this story for a few reasons. It grounds this research in the real experience of an individual and a family, and every participant that we spoke to had that same shock and horror, and the trauma reverberated through families and sometimes communities. And I also tell a story because it illustrates many of the overall findings from the interviews that we did, either because they aligned with the story or they contrasted with it. So one of the strongest themes of the suicides that people talked about was a sometimes unexpected nature. So just like in Eli's story, some describe suicides that were just out of the blue. So young men whose lives seemed to hold so much promise that died by suicide. So a woman who took this photo lost her brother, and she likened his suicide to the early frost that had occurred in Alberta in September, and spoke about how one day they were enjoying the harvest, and next, all that was left was the sad remains. And she said, "I wish he had given us the chance to hear him." And that was such a common refrain. I wish that he had trusted us enough to know that we would have been up for the journey of dealing with depression. And Eli's story also contrasts with other stories. So the young woman who took this photo also came from a close family, but he struggled with addiction and mental illness in a much more public way. And participants who spoke about loved ones self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, not trusting counseling or psychiatric care. And what was very common in these stories was that sense of failure, of not living up to the expectation. A mother of the boy who died in this photo talked about the way that she was kept in the dark, not only about her son's drug use and mental illness, but about mental illness in the family. So within rural communities, participants commented that keeping mental illness a secret and not discussing it was a way of preserving the ideal of the good family. So the rural participants, who are largely women, spoke about a brand of masculinity in which men are expected to be strong and vulnerable. And this woman reflected on what she saw as the vow of silence that men, and particularly rural men, are expected to employ. So in urban areas, there are more options for self-expression. In urban areas, there are more options for self-expression in different communities that men can join that affirm that self-expression. There are different ways of being in the world, whereas rural men have fewer options. So one participant spoke eloquently about the community that men are socialized into. You graduate, you get a job on the rigs, you make a lot of money, and they can see their life laid out before them with no way out. And this participant talked about if you fall outside of normal, there might not be a place for you. And several people also spoke about the powerful way that the oil and gas industry in Alberta is implicated in structuring these ideals of masculinity. So one mother talked about the intense campaigns in high schools that promise big money. So very young men go into very isolated communities and they're expected to be tough at any cost without the support of the family that they've known. So she related a story of her son having liquid metal falling down the front of his uniform that burned him badly. And the other workers laughed and told him to suck it up. So they'd learned to suck up pain, both emotional and physical. And participants in rural families talked about, even when they don't intend to, these families thought that they reproduced a very traditional gender roles in the context of their families. And the woman said, we've always tried to be non-sexist, but when I look at my family, we have very traditional gender roles. So one of the questions that we asked participants to reflect on was what would help prevent suicide in rural areas? So participants complicated the notion that you can love someone out of being depressed. So the cliche of, if only he knew how much he was loved, or if only we had loved him more. And in one case, it places just too big of a burden on survivors, but it also doesn't acknowledge the complexity of depression. So she thinks that, we have to really situate it as a brain condition and not the absence of love within families. So the mother of a son who died also talked about families. She talked about how parents are not vulnerable enough around their son because there's no expectations that their sons will experience vulnerability. She thought fathers model toughness and accomplishment, and what we need to teach boys is the language of vulnerability. One teacher in the community spoke about the value of instilling hope in young people. So she said, we load all this pressure and expectations and ideals, and we teach them about war and destruction and climate change, but we don't give them any hope, a reason to go on, a reason to fight back. And she said, we're doing young people, and especially young people who may be suffering from depression, a real disservice. So we took many of the photos that we had from Rimbey participants, and we launched a photo exhibit 2 weeks later, which was really fast. And it was launched at the Beatty House in Rimbey, which is a heritage house it's not very big. So 78 people came at the opening night to visit. These aren't the best quality photos, but I wanted to give you a sense of the building. So the room was packed, and we had people from the community and people from the project come and speak about the experience of doing the project and the value of beginning this conversation. And I have this video I'd like to show you. It's just a short clip of Emma, who spoke at the very beginning. And I wanted to show you because I think it really gives a sense of how it was initiated and embraced by the community. But I apologize because it's going to end very abruptly, because in the middle of her talk, the fire alarm went off. So here is Emma.
Experience depression and suicidal thoughts themselves. I think that's really meaningful work, and bringing it here felt important to me, and it feels really good to see all of you also come and participate. I think that for me, what's so meaningful about this work is the voice that it gives to people. And as someone who has experienced depression, I lost a brother to suicide, voicelessness can be such a tragic thing. So no matter who you're talking to, whether it's a teacher or a doctor or a therapist or wherever you're reaching out for help, it seems that there's never a black and white answer. The answer is always, it's going to be difficult and the road ahead is hard. And the only thing that everyone seems to agree on is that talking is important. So I hope that the end of this project, which has culminated in this gallery show, is just the beginning of something a lot bigger. And then we're able to talk about it here in Rimbey and with our.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the abrupt ending, but as Emma said, the importance of talking together as a community about these issues, I think, spans not only in rural areas that may have their own specific issues to deal with, but also many of them translate into rural contexts as well. The importance of troubling ideals of masculinity, the importance of troubling what's going on in the masculine industries, talking about depression in schools, and keeping those conversations alive in families so that the silence doesn't pervade. So Christina and I would like to thank you for listening, and if you'd like to ask any questions, you can email questions to Marilee Hughes at nursing.ubc.ca. The address is on your screen, and yes, thank you.
I've got a question. I wonder what surprised you about the exhibition. What surprised you the most about the exhibition?
I think what surprised me about the exhibition was the amount of talking that people were able to do about the issues. So people knew people who had taken the photos, which is a real difference than our larger exhibitions that occur in the urban areas. So they really engaged in conversations about the photos. They were able to ask the photographers why they took the photos and how they experienced the interviews. So there was a lot of interest and engagement in both the issue of men's suicide, but also the process of the research.
The methods are, we use them more and more, and but I think this is kind of the first time I've been involved in something that's gone country, So yeah, I guess a question for you, Christina, is around whether the methods, how we might anticipate the methods being different going into different communities, what we might adjust.
Well, in terms of the photo voice, it is the ultimate goal of a photo voice research is to reach the community. In that sense, the rural setting and the urban setting, in terms of the community, it is very similar ideas. It would be a bit challenging for the rural communities to get together, or maybe it is not challenging at all, because they have more close-knit community. Yeah, so how would we do it differently, or use a different aspects of the photo voice research in a different setting? It's a good question, but yeah. But actually, there's something that I wanted to share with the audience and with Jen especially, is that usually I interview men with direct experiences of suicide, and for the Rimbey sub-project, I interview 2 participants, and they were the women, the female participants who have lost their sons to suicide. And it was totally different experience on my part. And talking to men with direct experiences is challenging enough. But like talking to the mothers of those participants who lost their child to suicide, it was completely overwhelming at times. And yeah, it was so different experiences, and I really thought about you. I thought of you, Jen, because you did that. Like Jen usually talks to women with indirect experiences, and yeah, it was a good experience. But yeah, it's really different.
I had a question that sort of follows on that, in that your participant recruitment was very strongly skewed to women. So my observation, I guess, is that it still seems like even in this context where the conversation is opening up, it's still men are limited or inhibited from kind of engaging with the conversation. Are there ways to kind of help or facilitate that engagement with the recruitment, or even just the larger kind of participation in that kind of conversation?
Definitely, it was very challenging to recruit men. And interesting, at the photo exhibit, people were talking to Emma about like, how can, women were saying, how can we help? Like, what more can we do to, I don't know, help to engage with the conversation in the community? And Emma said, bring your husbands, bring your sons to the exhibit. And I thought that probably what might happen is that if we did another wave of interviewing in Rimbey, that we would have more men. I think that the women vetted the research, and once they were sold on its value, I think that they would have gone home and brought their husbands and their sons and given it the okay, But I think that few people were willing to, reach out directly to us as researchers. It would have been through their wives and sisters. And
It ran for 4 days after. So did you have a sense of what the traffic was?
It trickled the whole time, so that there was no more big showing of faces, but there was constant flow. And
were there men coming through, or?
It was largely women. I would say about another 60. It was at least 60 to 70% women. Yeah.
An ethics question. So the story, like Emma's story with her brother. It's such a powerful narrative, right? And the ethics of telling it. I just wonder, not from a BREB point of view, not from the official stance point of view, but from a research point of view, can you say something a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I did think about that the whole time through, and the family was so clear that they wanted his story out there, they wanted his name out there, they wanted their faces in there. The father actually gave me 2 files. One comprised entirely of photos that was taken at his funeral, and one about his whole life, like I think 100 photos of his life. And I think they wanted it to be used as a mechanism for prevention, but they also wanted his story not to die, so that his life would have had meaning. So there are so many dilemmas involved with that, but I wanted to honor that. And so by telling his story, in a sense, was saying thank you to them for doing that really, really hard work of telling the stories. Like it was so difficult for them to tell the story, and so I wanted to honor that by retelling their story.
Yeah, and congratulate you on the way you did that. It's tough, isn't it? Because it's kind of caught between that piece around de-stigmatizing something, but not sanitizing it.
Yeah,
it's such a delicate.
Yeah.
But I think you did a really good job.
I don't think we have any other questions from our remote viewers. Is there any final thoughts that you want to share before we end the webinar?
I don't think so. Thank you.
And the session will be archived on our YouTube account for Men's Depression and Suicide Network. So if people want to share this with other people, it'll be possible to view it after the live session as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.